And as I was telling you, hello, good afternoon, day or night, depending on the time zone you are in. And welcome to the virtual roundtable Al otro lado del río, Stories of the Borderlands. My name is Gabriel Dominguez, and I am the Assistant Director of the Thomas J. Harris Institute for Hispanic and International Communication in the College of Media and Communication at Texas Tech University. And it's an honor and delight serving as a moderator of this event. As you may know, part of the Institute's mission is to create knowledge and encourage greater intercultural awareness through informed interaction among students, teachers, researchers, media industry representatives, and community organizations. This event is precisely aimed at that goal. So I want to thank you so much, each one of the panelists, for their disposition and willingness to destiny part of their packed schedule to be here with us today. I know that some of you are probably traveling around the world and invested his time in a lot of different activities. So thank you so much for having this moment to talk a little bit about your work. And also thanks to the Harris Institute Director, Dr. Ken Wilkinson, for his support to make this event possible. Before starting, I want to set the stage and share some data to frame this conversation in a contemporary context. The United States has more immigrants than any other country. According to the Pew Research Center, by 2065, 78 million people living in the US will be migrants, and 81 million will be born in the US to immigrant parents. This data means that about 1 in 3 US inhabitants will be immigrants. These population changes will have a meaningful impact in several areas, such as politics and education. Immigrants today account for 13.7% of the US population. While immigrants from Mexico have dominated the flows post-1917, the composition of new arrivals has changed since 2010. Recently arrived immigrants are more likely to come from Asia, with India and China leading the way, and Central America. Most immigrants, 77%, are in the country legally. Despite this fact, and we all have been witness through media despicable hate crimes, immigrants face problems ranging from the lack of opportunities and discrimination to racism and exclusion. And with these factors, language is an essential barrier, as many immigrants are not proficient English speakers when they arrive. Spanish predominates as the immigrant's language. In addition to these difficulties, the unauthorized immigrant population faces obstacles to achieve their citizenship. Legalizing many unauthorized immigrants is still a pending matter with not viable solution in sight. In this regard, art is a powerful tool to express and explore the reality of immigration, its implication in everyday life, and foresee potential answers to the problems migrants face. This fact is possible because artists have a fundamental role in interpreting these realities. They bring into sharper focus the journeys immigrants have experienced and sensitize the audiences about the different motivations that have pushed migrants to leave behind their motherland and find a new place that they can call home. Without more preamble, let me turn this conversation to our panelists. The way we plan this is that our speakers will introduce us to their work and how it portrays the migrant experience in the issues they face. During their participation, they will explain the relationship they are trying to build between the audiences and the stories of the borderlands that they are conveying. I will introduce each one of them at the moment of their participation according to our schedule, and the panelists will have 10 minutes each, so we can have chance for a Q&A once they finish their presentations. Please, in the meantime, feel free to type your questions on the chat at any time, and I will be glad to read them once we finish the first round of interventions. Now, it's for me a pleasure to present you and giving the floor to Fernando Frias. He's a Mexican documentary filmmaker, screenwriter, and award-winning director. He's an alumnus of Columbia University, where he received his MFA in directing and screenwriting as a Fulbright scholar. He recently directed all 6 episodes of the first season of Los Spookies on HBO from Saturday Night Live alumnus Julio Torres and Fred Armisen. Fernando wrote, directed, and produced his latest feature, I'm No Longer Here, Ya No Estoy Aquí, selected for the Sundance Screenwriters Lab and won over them prestigious development production and post-production grants. The film has gone on to win the feature film competition and audience prizes at the Morelia Film Festival in 2019 and Best Film at the Cairo International Film Festival. It has also garnered 10 Mexican Academy Premios Arieles, including Best Director, Best Picture, and Best Script. It has been nominated at the Goya Awards and was part of the Best Foreign Film shortlist representing Mexico at the Oscars in 2021. Unfortunately, it wasn't selected, but it should be there. Thanks to this work, Fernando is nominated by the Directors Guild of America as Outstanding Directorial Achievement in First and Feature Film. Thank you so much, Fernando, for being here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here sharing the panel, and thank you for the invitation, of course. Well, just like jumping right into our subject matter, I'll start by just saying that for me, you know, like part of my process has always to do with the cultural clash, with the cultural exchange. You know, like every project that I've done for one reason or the other, it's not that I have it like in my mind, you know, like as a goal or anything. It's just like the ideas that I have end up like having that as a background, you know. I mean, and looking back, I think like it's a very fertile ground to understand, you know, because communication at a very level, at a very basic human level, you know, like can be something very representative, you know, and essential of what like characters are living, you know, like so there's like you know, like when you don't speak the language, it's probably like harder to lie, you know, or something like that, you know. And also it's an opportunity, of course, to create empathy and, you know, for characters to connect through disconnection, actually, like, you know, like through apparent disconnection to actually like pursue connection in a more spontaneous way, if you want. So that has been like an element that has been part of my projects since the beginning, and in different ways. You know, I had another film before I went to New York called Receta, which is like the story of an Albanian model landing in Mexico City, you know. And a lot of people sometimes when they saw it, like, oh, they thought it was like non-realistic, but you know, the actually, like, the film is based on someone who, like, the girl who plays Receta, her actual name is Receta, and she's playing an exaggerated version of herself, you know. And the fact that some people around the world in festivals were saying like, oh, this is completely unrealistic. I would never imagine an Albanian model living in Mexico City. And I'm like, well, you know, like maybe, you know, like there are some stereotypes that we don't know that we are reinforcing, but we are definitely reinforcing by you know, like having this idea. So ever since another very important element, rather on top, or the second layer, if you want, from building from this like cultural clash situation, it's that of questioning or challenging the stereotypical the idea of not reinforcing stereotypes the way that mass media does, you know. That's something that's very important for me. And also, like, my fiction work goes around small fiction lines, storylines that try to connect the aspects that come from reality, you know, from social, political, you know, cultural, or like countercultural movements, touching up on real moments, real places, you know. For this last film, Ya no estoy aquí, a film that was accepted with so much love in Mexico and around the world, and that makes me incredibly happy, because it's a film that in which we knew that we wanted to again question these stereotypes, you know, especially when we've lived in times of politics where, like, you know, like the immigrant is seen as like the enemy, you know, the boogeyman. Here comes, you know, like these people who are dangerous and who are, like, you know, to be afraid of, you know, to fear. And this idea of like every immigrant in the United States who is Hispanic is the same, you know, or every Mexican in the States is the same, you know. And there's like, of course not, you know. There's like so not everyone is there for the same reason. Of course, one thing is like forced migration. There are so many different things, you know. And I not every Mexican in the States are going through similar things, or not everyone wants to be there to begin with, you know, like and then, you know, like I felt like audiences, especially in the US, need to understand a little bit of the background of the story of their country, just like what Gabriel was saying. Like, these numbers are shocking, you know, and I think they need to be upfront in you know, for people to understand how their society and their communities are formed, you know. And when I think about, recently I've been researching a lot about Central America for another project along with Oscar Martinez, the journalist, you know, and it's incredible, you know, like for people to think that people in the United States sometimes they just see like the part of the story of history that like is connected to their present day, but not behind, you know, like in the case of Central America, you know, like the interventionism of the U.S., you know, and since the 1954 and the establishment of dictatorship in Guatemala, you know, or like all of the deportation of like 10,000 inmates from El Salvador back to El Salvador, you know, and how that affected and how people were like escaping from there, you know, and so for me as a filmmaker, it's very important to show stories that can actually, you know, expand and connect, expand the people's perspective, you know, and at least like offer like a larger map, a larger but not really trying to make a documentary and pushing information, but actually like setting life of like characters that feel real and that can be that we can feel empathy for, and who are part of those contexts, you know, and maybe by showing one or two who like have like a very different case or something, it's easier to understand like the whole situation, you know. I always say like sometimes, you know, like these big events in history are like harder for us to relate to, you know. Like I connected personally with filmmaking and because of identification that I felt, you know. I was used to like watching like huge films of action and like, you know, science fiction and stuff, but it was what impacted me the most is where I saw my life, you know, reflected in a big screen, you know, and through that identification is like it's something that I want to like use, of course, to tell the stories that I'm interested in telling, you know, and offering a wider perspective into things like immigration, of course. You know, in the last film, the main character Ulises needs to escape Monterrey, the violence, because of like a conflict between two cartels, you know, and because of like the strategy that the government took back then in 2010, you know, and all of these little things that, you know, are like domino pieces, you know, that affect him even without him knowing, you know, that like how he is a consequence of all these things. So yeah, trying to offer a window into these connecting points through the life of a character who audiences can connect with. For me, it's something very, very important, you know.
Thank you so much, Fernando. And as I was telling you before this presentation, feel free to type your questions in the chat. Use that. Now you can presenting these different concernings or questions that raise each one of the interactions. So feel free to do this. Now let me turn this floor to Dr. Elvira Carrissaldux. She's an assistant professor of practice and undergraduate academic advisor for Chicano and Chicano studies at the University of Texas at El Paso, where she earned a Doctor of Philosophy degree in rhetoric and composition. She earned a Master of Fine Arts degree in film from Columbia University in the city of New York, and a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in journalism and Chicano studies, and a minor in theater arts as well. Her academic and creative writing and digital projects centered the lives of women and racially and economically disadvantaged communities. Dr. Dukes is writing a digital project based on her research on child's consciousness. She's also a comic book author, playwright, and filmmaker. Together with her husband, Ronnie Dukes, they started dukescomics.com, an independent comic book publisher whose mission is to create a positive vision for the future of Black and Brown people. To learn more about their comics, visit www.dukescomics.com. Dr. Dukes proudly serves as a board member for Equal Footing, a nonprofit whose mission is to empower women to tell their stories. To support this initiative, visit www.equalfootingcharity.org. Thank you so much, Elvira, for being here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I wanted to share a presentation. Is it okay for me to share my screen, Gabriel? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, and hopefully you're seeing my screen. Give me a thumbs up. Okay, perfect. All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Karisal Dukes, and I'm an assistant professor of practice at Chicano Studies at the University of Texas in El Paso. And this is where I'm from. I grew up in a colonia outside of El Paso called Chaparral, New Mexico. My presentation today is called Going AWOL on the US-Mexico Border, a comic book adventure navigating realities. And I just want to say, after listening to Fernando, I realized we both went to Colombia, right, Fernando? I didn't even realize that. So
yes, we
that's
both
really
went to Colombia.
I just realized that. Nice. Okay, so we got to talk. But anyway, I relate a lot to Fernando, and I just want to thank Gabriel for inviting me to this. Because your film is amazing, and it's very similar to what I'm studying right now in my doctoral research. I'm studying Cholo and Chola subculture communities, and I'm trying to, I'm writing a project right now about Cholex consciousness. And so this is a little bit about what I'll be talking about today. And specifically, my goal is to discuss how my work aims to build a society that promotes change. And so Cholex consciousness is super important, because in order to create change, first we have to get at the consciousness of people. And Fernando mentioned, you know, it's very important for us to know the history of our cultures, for example. And so thank you for that, Fernando. So to begin with, I place all of my work, anything that I do takes place here in my hometown in El Paso, which is on the border of Juarez. It's the largest, one of the largest binational communities in the world, with a combined population of over 2.5 million people. And so this right here, this is just some video that I shot on the edge of my campus, the University of Texas at El Paso, UTEP. So this is the edge of our campus looking over at Juarez. So basically the only thing that really separates us, you see the highway, I-10, and then you see the Rio, and then of course, I'll show you some more images right now of the actual wall, but you can see it there as well. I'm a first-gen college grad. I come from a large Mexican family. My mom is from Chihuahua. She's an immigrant. And my father, born and raised in El Paso. But of course, I'm, you know, a child of migrants, and I think a lot of us are, which is what we're trying to discuss today. I'm also a comic book author, and this is really important to my work, because I'm a researcher and a scholar, but I also practice, and I put theory to practice through my artistic works. So I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next slide. I base my work on a theoretical framework called Chicano Feminist Epistemology, which is basically where we theorize about our own bodies. So in other words, we are the experts of our own experiences because we live through these experiences. And so the knowledge of the people in your community is just as valuable as the knowledge of a Eurocentric male from another country that maybe wrote a book about your culture. But you know, the people that are living these experiences are also experts. And so that's what CFE calls us to do. It's an anti-oppressive social justice approach. And what's also crucial about this is that these scholars and researchers that are doing this type of work are also members of the community that we write about. So not only are we the subjects, but we're also the agents. We're the ones that are making it possible to have these stories be told through our written works. And the purpose of this is to disrupt hegemonic systems and ideologies. So the dominant culture that pretty much is sort of the gatekeeper of Hollywood, for example, or any of these institutions that we are a part of. And of course, the other mission is to lift our communities. So I'm also inspired by the work of Thomas King, and he wrote a book called The Truth About Stories, a Native Narrative. And what's really interesting about this book, there's a quote that I have here, though the border doesn't mean that much, he says, though the border doesn't mean that much to the majority of Native people in either country, it is, after all, a figment of someone else's imagination. And that's really crucial because as Viera, so the next author that I want to discuss, it's a book called American by Paper. Viera in 2016, she discusses how writing is a technology of oppression and can be used as a bureaucratic tool to construct race through immigration law, for example. It's also used to classify and manage us. And, you know, if we go back to history, as Fernando was saying earlier, when we look at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we know that there were many people that were living on the United States, in the United States, and when the border was made, people had to choose whether to, you know, when Mexico was cut in half, basically, and the United States acquired the northern part, people had to choose whether to stay in the United States or go back to Mexico. And so all of these new ways of living were invented, right? So these are all ideas that are invented. Even this border wall that we're seeing, this was somebody's idea. Somebody came up with the idea, let's create a wall. Somebody designed it, and then they put it to practice. But for so many years before, you know, especially before the 1960s, when the border became highly militarized, this is during Nixon, the war on drugs was created, was invented. All of a sudden there's longer lines at the border. And so that's when we start to see this new image of what divides the valley that we live in. And it's also what makes the difference between being Mexican and being Mexican American is this object right here. That's what divides us. I also think it's important to think about what we have lost. So I'm also inspired by Gloria Anzaldúa. She wrote a book called Light in the Dark. And here she says, we attempt again and again to find what we have lost by digging into our cultural roots, imaginatively, and making art from our findings. And so that's really the mission that we're on right now as artists. We're creating social justice oriented composition. In our case, Fernando and I, moving image composition. It's a story that we create, that we construct through the use of images and oral material as well. So here there's an image, a still image of my film Mariposa, which takes place here in El Paso and Juarez. And so here you can see the puente that leads you into downtown El Paso. And my main character is here wearing a pink shirt. It might be a little bit hard to see her, but she's going against everyone else, right? So she's going into Juarez and everyone else is going out of Juarez. And so that's also a powerful image of migrants just constantly moving back and forth. And this is just a daily image of what we would see at the border. I also use a method called counter story, which is to do the work that it takes to write ourselves. So we know that we are absent from histories. We know that our perspectives are not being centered. And here we see, like in Hollywood, for example, you know, the number of Chicanas that are filmmakers and the number of women that are filmmakers. And so we know this. And so now what we need to do is we actually need to start now creating these stories. And Aja Martinez, she describes counter story as a kind of counter reality created by or experienced by outgroups subordinate to those atop the racial and gendered hierarchy. So therefore, I argue that Chicana filmmaking is a rhetorical tool that should be used consciously to combat oppression during a time of increased hateful and discriminatory acts. So this brings me to my project, AWOL, which started off as a screenplay. I tried making the film here in my colonia with about $5,000 that a local businessman donated to our production. I also worked with a class at UTEP, a special topics course. And so there was a group of about 10 to 15 students that helped me work on this film. And so this is a still image of the unreleased film, because I did work on this project for about 4 years and then just kind of decided that it just really wasn't the quality that I was hoping it would be. It's an action film. There's a lot of military, and with $5,000, it was really difficult. And so that at that point, I turned to my partner, Ronnie Dukes, my husband, and together we decided to make this into a comic book to make it more accessible. And so the reason why this is important is because, first of all, I am just changing what is typical of a writer in comics, right? So usually there's a lot of men in the comic book industry, just like film. We also feature a Latina protagonist, which is also jarring, right? This is not what we're used to seeing. She represents a Latina. And so in many ways, this is a call to change, right? And I met that call and I produced my own book. The other thing that I try to portray is the idea of the fact that we do come from migrants, many of us. And so in my book, there's a scene where Cruz Ochoa, you know, she finds out that her brother has been kidnapped and she's about to ship off on a military mission. And she decides that she needs to go find her brother. You know, family is very important to her, and especially in Latino families, it's very important. And so she has to make that tough decision to go find her brother. And for her, it's no problem. Of course, I'm going to find my brother. But her father, who has, you know, grew up in a different time period where you have to listen to authority and do what authority tells you to do, he's telling her, no, don't go look for your brother. Like, follow the law, you know, do what you're supposed to do, follow your orders. So here we see sort of a clash of generational differences, but it's also, you know, she's having to balance her own family traditions with her new role and status being in the military in the United States. The other thing that's important in my work is that I come from the barrio, and so that's something that I want to depict in my work as well. In our book, Cruz, you know, she's from the barrio, and as she's looking for her brother, we see her navigating all the different spaces within her community. So in one scene here at the top corner, she's talking to the local barber, you know, and she's asking him for questions. And then later she goes into downtown El Paso and she ends up being in the Museum of Art. And so a more kind of fancy setting, but she's able to adapt. And that's the thing about this liminal space that we live in the US, in El Paso and Juarez, is that there's always movement of people and objects, and it's not that easy to tell the difference. And we're able to adapt, we're able to be flexible and move. And that's what being migrants is. So the implications of this is that we have to be conscious of what has been written about us, and realize that those are somebody else's inventions, somebody else's ideas, and we can do the same thing. And so my call today is for us to go AWOL and to create these counter stories that are going to sort of reveal the dominant and oppressive narratives that are keeping us in subordinate positions. And so another way to do this, as I mentioned, is putting brown women as protagonists or the heroes of our stories. and reclaiming our roots and publishing our history from our perspectives. And so just, I'll just kind of wrap that up. And so I hope that I kind of touched on it. I don't want to go over more time, Gabo, so I'll just stop right there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Elvira. We appreciate all your work that you have invested in these projects. And I think that we are learning different ways to approach this topic that is really engaging. Now, I want to give the floor to Ivan Uriel. Let me introduce to you the work of Ivan. He's a writer, poet, political scientist, and filmmaker, considered an innovator of testimonial narrative and Hispanic poetic prose. His novels El Surco, El Ítamo, and El Muro complete his trilogy Apología del Encuentro, as well as his poetry books Navegar sin remos and Puntos Cardinales, which explore the human relationships from universal migration, have been studied in several universities around the world. Ivan Uriel dedicates his activities to social development, human and civil rights, community work, and the design of social projects and educational programs. For his work, he received the National Award Contribution to Mexican Literature and the Literary Academy of Mexico City's annual award. In public policy, he specializes in participatory programs and social studies. He's also a co-author in the books PIUS, Urban Social Programs and Initiatives, and Towards Safe Cities. He directed the documentary films The Human Voice about Jean Cocteau's work and the trilogy about the labor and human rights of women domestic workers in a worldwide perspective, Día de Descanso, De Sueño, and Lucha y Memoria. Uriel is a political scientist by UPAEP University in Mexico, and he earned a master's degree in Spanish and Latin American literature from the University of Barcelona, Spain. Thank you, Ivan, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Thank you for the invitation, Thomas Harris James Institute, and of course to Texas Tech. Thank you. I am such an honor to be here with you, sharing this wonderful roundtable with Elvira, wonderful work, and Rita. All your papers are inspiring, and of course, Fernando, you made one of the greatest masterpieces of this century. Thank you, Fernando, for that great movie. And thank you all for your time, for sharing with us this morning here in Mexico. Les mando un gran saludo desde Mexico. Well, I'm gonna tell you about my trilogy about migration stories. So I started writing just because immigration, because my father migrated when I was a child to United States. And I remember clearly the day that he took the bus until the frontier, and he doesn't have any document. And when we were going back to the home, and I was just as I said, 9 years old, I was thinking about him, about what's going on with the perspective, with the family at that time. So I found in the writing the possibility to create a different reality, to create a place for my own as a child. So I started writing those stories about migration. And several years later, when my father come back, and I got the opportunity to be studying at the college, I talked with him and said, you know, I am here because of you, because my mother's job too. So I really I have the necessity to follow your step, to know where exactly you were working, you were living, live at the same place, work at the same job. So I start this process working at the kitchens in US. I couldn't receive a salary, but I could work. So I start working at the kitchens from 10 a.m. to 5 a.m. And after that, at the furrow. So my first novel is called El Surco, the furrow. That is a novel in where converge different stories from my colleagues there, especially women, because the women are the protagonists of my trilogy. So El Surco is a novel in where you can find different stories, different perspectives of migration, the causes and consequences, but at the same time, many answers that doesn't have questions before. That for me was pretty important to know. So my writing doesn't have any goal, just to share the voices of the character there. So this is the novel, El Surco. As you see, the novel is a call for try to find each other in this furrow, like life is, like this event is, and a furrow in where we can see each other and we can have the possibility to find each other with all our different cultures, customs, traditions, and the point of view about light and night, about the dark and light, and about the death and life and the hope. So we migrate for different reasons, of course, for survive, for get a dream, for different reasons. But in the end, we got this flag to be traveling. And we understand, and I understand with my, when I was writing that those peoples that travel migrate, but the people that stays migrate too, because all are inside in this migration process, and the migration is an call for find each other in this perspective. So when I was writing on the furrow, that took me 7 years of writing. In the middle of the process, in my family we got in a huge tragedy where my parents, both of them, they passed away at the same time. So in that moment, the writing for me was a hell. So I say to all the students that writing the art is healing the soul, healing the possibility to keep going on. And for me, the migration was this call to going on, to share those stories, and all the pain for me was at the same time and a call for hope. And this is the way in where was born El Ítamo, the second part of the trilogy. The Ítamo is in a novel in where it's a fictional novel in where you can find, sorry because the sound, but it's a novel about the quest for a plant that cure everything. And right now, and in the last year, and we are in the middle of the pandemic, of course, and we are suffering a lot and with a lot of uncertainty about the future. We are trying to find this cure for, not just for the disease, but for the cure for all the painful that we are suffering, but at the same time, with the wishes to be going on the process. So when I have the opportunity to share with the audience, especially with universities worldwide, the Ítamo for me is a tool to share about their dreams, about what they think about the migration, of course, but about what is this Ítamo, what you move or keep moving to your dreams, to your goals, and to keep going no matter what is the odds against you. So this is for me the migration. We are going on on the path, and we are trying to build on a new way together. So that was the way in where the third part of the trilogy, the wall, el muro. I show you here the cover. The el muro, the wall, is in a novel in where, for me, the most important thing in the end of this process of the migration is the creation of new languages, the creation of new culture, the creation of new artistical ways of expression. So for me, this is the migration. It's the possibility to have a different encounters like today we have in those different kind of perspective of the art, and is a call to defeat of the boundaries, defeat of the walls, and not just build a bridge. It's a call to keep going, coming from different ways, and found us on the road of the hope and the perspective to the migration, not just for reflection, just for action too. So the migration is a reality. And right now in the pandemic, I was thinking a lot about the children, the families that are in the middle of the boundaries, that are going on, because of course we are living in the pandemic, but they are trying to get it to that place because for a better life, for a better world, for a different world, and for creating a reality for their own. So we are, every day, we are woke up and we say, we got this new opportunity to do something with what we are doing. So in our side with the artistical way, we got a lot of responsibility and of course the commitment, but in the end it's part of a process to make the possibility that the dialogue succeed could be a reality from the art. So I send the message to encourage you, to all of you, to writing, to do movies, short films, and comics like Elvira, and to express all your thoughts about immigration, because we can create a different languages. We can create a different culture, counterculture process, movements, but together, coming from different sides, we can make reality the fight for their civil rights, the fight for their labor rights, the human rights, and in the end, the fight for be happy in this world and try to find this way. Of course, it's hard. Of course, we have a lot of pain every day, but in the end, the hope is still there. So many things are around the migration, and for me, the hope is the perspective of the future. We are living in the 21st century, and like I'm Not Here, for example, in that movie, we can find exactly that the lead character is going on, is trying to find his own place. So for me, this is a great and a powerful images. And through my writing, I try to do it, but try to make a forum for in different venues or presentations. For me, the most important thing is not presenting my novels or books. The great thing is to have this chat, these meetings, and the reflections that are around at the environment. So thank you so much, Texas Tech. Thank you so much, Gabriel Partida. And thank you all for your time. Ready to keep in touch to you. Thank you, guys. Un gran abrazo desde México. Muchas gracias. Un abrazo.
Thank you so much, Ivan. And now let me introduce you, lastly but not least, Dr. Rita Anderson. She is from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and was delighted to return to the Southwest US when she joined Texas Tech's Spanish faculty in 2019. After completing a PhD in Spanish literature at Washington University in St. Louis and directing the Latin American Studies Center at the University of Maryland for 2 years. She teaches classes on US Latinx studies, border studies, Latin American film, and cultures of the Spanish-speaking world. In her research, she examines contemporary Latinx and media cultural production through the lens of gender, performance, and border studies. She studies the borders, or the policing of movement and belonging, that transverse the US and Mexico, and the performances, public art, and literature that respond to and undermine these borders. She investigates the state and corporate systems that extend the militarized border logic far beyond the geopolitical border, including highways, prisons, and factories. Her recent publications on a Mexican feminist hip-hop collective and recent performance art at the US-Mexico border wall focus on the production of solidarity through transnational collaboration and affective expression. Thank you so much, Rita, for being here with us today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much to Gabriel and to Kent for the invitation. And thank you so much to my co-panelists for their words. I am just so honored to be on this panel among these voices, and all three of you, I'm really in awe of your praxis, of the way that you bring ideas and theories into creative production. And I think this type of dialogue between practitioners and academics is just exactly what we need. So I'm thrilled to be a part of it. I also do have some slides to show. So am I able to share my screen now? I think so. Are you all able to see that? Can I get a thumbs up? Fantastic, thank you. Well, we have heard from a number of different genres, and I'm going to take things in a little bit of a different direction to share about some recent work about performance art at the US-Mexico border. In this project, I examine what and who gets labeled and treated as a crisis, and how acts of performance can change that. And, you know, I come to this work with a deep interest in the wisdom of embodied lived experiences, and with recognition of the limits of my own comprehension as I am learning from a community that I am not a part of. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, very aware of the internal borders of my city, and also aware of art making and language learning as tools that can begin to dismantle those borders. So migration is neither a crisis nor an aberration, but rather a constant throughout human history. Human movement across geopolitical borders is a catalyst of progress, growth, and new networks of communication. The vocabulary of crisis deployed against migrants in US political rhetoric and the framing of migration as an invasion has deep historical roots and has always been racialized. By declaring a crisis, the state gains a more compliant public. Governments declare crises, even when none are present, in order to enact a state of exception. Many citizens, alarmed, tolerate the suspension of rights as a temporary measure to weather an emergency, as Naomi Klein explores in The Shock Doctrine. By framing the natural phenomenon of human migration as an emergency, the state rationalizes the intensification of violence and surveillance. The construction of barriers and the maintenance of apparatuses of surveillance and detention are global, high-profit industries, which rely on the continual manufacturing of crisis to justify their existence. ICE spent $3.1 billion apprehending migrants in 2018, holding them in centers that make up the world's largest immigration detention system, 70% of which are run by private corporations. In January of 2019 and February 2020, President Trump declared national emergencies in order to categorize migration as an urgent security threat and redirect defense spending for wall construction. And before the Trump presidency, the border wall was already one of the largest scale, least impeded infrastructure projects the US has ever seen, due in part to the 2006 Secure Fence Act, which allowed construction regardless of existing laws protecting native land or the environment. So again, well before Trump, we see this suspension of rights within the context of this manufactured idea of crisis. Right now, what we're seeing is Governor Abbott sending state troopers to the Texas border, and again, using this language of crisis. The migrants, now accused of bringing a crisis to the border, are paradoxically often the ones experiencing true emergencies, frequently fleeing crises at home linked to previous US intervention. Migrants face trauma on their hostile journeys northward as border infrastructure drives them into the deadliest areas of the desert. The physically unlivable conditions of this humanitarian crisis contrast sharply with the state's manufactured discourse of invasion. The three performances that I want to share with you challenge immigration as crisis discourse in surprising and effective ways. Through collaboration, the works reimagine the border as a space of co-creation, intimacy, and solidarity. In her 2011 work, Borrando la Frontera, Ana Teresa Fernandez creates the illusion of a gap in the border fence between San Diego and Tijuana, making the permeability of border infrastructure visible while engaging the imagination to envision or make imaginable a trajectory through the barrier. By visually dematerializing the wall, the physical manifestation of crisis discourse, Fernandez then denaturalizes its presence. This act asserts the actual porousness of the current border, declaring the reality of interconnected trans-border exchange and the actual inefficacy and penetrability of the wall's infrastructure. Fernandez states, quote, "These tracks stand vertically next to each other, like prison bars across the sand and into the ocean. In my ideal world, I wanted to topple them. The only way I knew how was through my own weapon, paint." Her performance makes that ideal world symbolically present. In 2015, Fernandez reimagined the performance as a collective act of painting with US students and Mexican residents and migrants. She worked with volunteers from Arizona and Sonora at Ambos Nogales to paint a 50-foot stretch of the southern side of the wall a striking blue. Her most recent and collaborative iteration of the work took place in April of 2016 when she worked with border organizations, schools, and community members in Mexicali, Agua Prieta, and Ciudad Juarez to simultaneously paint 3 sections of the wall to match the sky. The rhetoric of crisis, as manufactured by the state, prioritizes the individual over the collective. Acts of collaboration then propose an anti-capitalist ethos by offering an alternative to individual protectionism and pursuit of profit. Photos of the Nogales performance, which Fernandez calls a social sculpture, shows Mexican and US residents holding ladders stable for one another, passing paint receptacles, smiling, and building new alliances with people that they otherwise would not have met. This embodied art practice suggests the possibility of future solidarity between participants, envisioned as collective action and a willingness to take mutual risks for one another. Inauguration Day, 2017. Quietly, exchanging smiles and clasping hands, 52 women make their way onto the Paso del Norte, an international bridge between Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. The women, residents of both cities, line up back to back as organizers braid each pair's hair together, forming a human chain spanning the bridge. The performance, called Braiding Borders or Trenzando Fronteras, and organized by the transnational coalition Boundless Across Borders, was designed to respond to political rhetoric against immigrants and women with a sign of peaceful resistance, strength, and solidarity. While crisis discourse constructs the border as a site of perpetually heightened alarm, the simple ritual of grooming hair, made public and social, infuses the border with a sense of the normality of everyday life. Crisis distances and numbs people to the reality of others' experiences. Trenzando Fronteras counters this separation with bodily immediacy. Through the participants present, through the dependence of physically weaving themselves together, participants present direct touch as a striking protest of the border machinery's violence. Where walls separate, touch creates relationality. The slow, soothing gesture of brushing and braiding hair together has a calming effect, in opposition to the state of shock provoked by crisis rhetoric. The gentleness with which the women must move when physically intertwined by their roots enacts an ethics of mutual caretaking, which counters the individualist crisis mindset. This performance highlights existing bonds between the two cities and generates new networks of communication. It showcases the interconnectedness and existing relationships between women in the two cities, while also braiding together co-creators who had not previously met. The collective formed through this human chain enacts a non-lucrative exchange of touch and feeling, asserting each participant's value beyond their labor or potential for profit, well situated in a space characterized by the international flow of goods and capital. Through the production of a physically intertwined collective on the international bridge, Trenzando Fronteras proposes the restoration of mutual empathy, the possibility of healing, and the building of new relationships through emotional and physical exchange. And finally, July 28th, 2019, a man strides toward the wall between Puerto de Anapra and Sunland Park, holding a bright pink teeter-totter. Without asking permission, he positions the playground equipment, using the wall as a fulcrum. Within minutes, residents from both communities straddle the seats, grasp the handles, and begin to play. This intervention was carried out by Ronald Rael and Virginia Sanfratello with Juarez-based Colectivo Chopeque. Rather than normalizing the violence of border security, the participants, in enjoying an ordinary moment of play, demonumentalize it by operating outside the signifiers of crisis. teeter-totter wall symbolically renders the wall impotent by refusing to perpetuate the fear, separation, and alarm that it is designed to create. Participants destabilize the wall when, in the face of its material representation of crisis, they refuse to panic and opt instead for relationality, for fun, for the possibility of empathy and shared ordinary experiences. The emotional lightheartedness of the event does not obscure the violence of the border, but rather coexists within it. For those familiar with the context of violence in the region, the shade of pink of the teeter-totters evokes the pink crosses mounted across Ciudad Juarez at the sites of women's murders, a sign of mourning and protest of feminicide. The hue is at once cheerful and somber, much like the juxtaposition of playground equipment and border security infrastructure. The inviting horizontal lines of the teeter-totters assert residents' right to approach and engage with the infrastructure. This affirmation of human mobility undermines the incursion of military personnel and architecture. The performance's leisure activity contrasts sharply with the privatization of the border wall construction contracts. The act of transforming the border into a platform for public participation reframes the space from private or state property run according to the logic of crisis and profitability to a non-lucrative public space. The collaborators, while rising and falling on either side of the border, while they ride on the teeter-totters, demonstrate an interconnected cross-border balance in which bodies and actions in one nation impact outcomes elsewhere. The playful performance of this balance allows viewers to imagine a future transnational community of people actively and empathetically in touch with one another. So the three performances examined here bring everyday life, moments of touch and collaboration into the contested site of the border. They naturalize migration by denaturalizing the wall. They generate emotional responses and forms of human connection that operate outside the language of crisis. The outcomes of these acts are not immediately obvious nor easily measurable. While the performances themselves are fleeting, their traces continue. Images from Teeter-Totter Wall continue to circulate online. Women who met during Trenzando Fronteras are still talking regularly. In places, the blue paint from Borrando la Frontera remains, continuing to imagine a future beyond our current crisis. So thank you all for your time and attention, and I'm excited to move into the next part of the talk with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rita, for all your exposition, for your presentation in this moment. I think that it brings a lot of topics and interesting questions. I'm looking at all the exciting questions that are on the chat. I think that we won't have time to go over all of them, but I want to start this part of this last part of the session by asking you something that probably can merge some of the questions that I'm looking at the chat. So, how do your work, or how can we manage, on the one hand, presenting an accurate representation of immigrants with their pros and cons, and on the other hand, avoiding images that could reinforce stereotypical representations of migrants?
Can you repeat the second part, Gabriel?
Yes, of course. The second part is, how can we, by conveying these images that are showing us the light and darkness of the life of migrants in their original countries or in their homelands, how can we avoid to convey images that could reinforce stereotypical representations that probably in the US have permeated media for a long time?
I think, if I can jump in, audiences definitely value, honesty and realism, and of course it's like someone could say that it's David versus Goliath when you think about, you know, like the exploitation of like the region's tragedy, you know, like I have to tell you from my own experience, you know, like after the film, like all of the submissions that I get from projects, you know, it's either, you know, like the stories around, you know, narcos, but in the way that it's already like exploited, glorifying violence, you know, and because that sells, you know, and then like on the other side, on the other hand, you have only the same stories over and over, but now with the Latino color, you know, or with like the, you know, just the last layer, you know, like just the frosting, but it's the same story, you know, and we have to start understanding that true representation is not about only the characters or only about the superficial level layers of storytelling or narrative or art in general. I think truthful representation comes from understanding and defining the architecture of storytelling, the structure of storytelling. It doesn't have to, you know, comply with what has been like done already, you know, but of course, like media and entertainment will push for something which success is guaranteed somehow. So you know, like basically what I'm saying is repeating formulas over and over. But there's a way to connect with people and larger audiences when you approach your subject matter with respect, you know, and you yourself have to like ask yourself as an author, as a creator, the hard questions. Why am I doing what I'm doing? You know, like when I'm not from Monterrey myself, I'm from Mexico City, and the film I made, it's set in Monterrey, and then you know, like the way the world is going right now, like with all of the what's correct to do and what's not correct to do, it's like we have to be careful, because if we are just talking about representation, like you can only talk about what you have lived or what you know. I don't really agree with that, you know, because then in the end it will only be like autobiographical content, and that's not the point. And sometimes by being an outsider, you can observe things that are already like normalized, you know. So where I'm going with this is that you have to ask yourself these questions. Why do you want to do the things you want to do, or how can you allow yourself to use the angle that you are using? Why? You know, I can talk from my own personal experience, you know, like not being from Monterrey and having like the cholo culture there, like the Colombianos and their love for the cumbia, and of course there's something that, you know, in life sometimes you like something and then later on you understand what's behind that something, and it makes sense that you like it in the first place, you know, like, so maybe like this like colorful aspects and the visuals and the hair and the music, but then you understand that all of those elements have a meaning, you know, and are like inherently contestatory to life experience, to circumstances, to problematic, to systematic oppression, to many things, you know. So me being from Mexico City and wanting to tell a story that it's set in somehow in the border, I ask myself, why? I mean, when you go to Monterrey and to those places, it's very interesting, you know, and there's many things that can be like distractors. You want to show this, you want to show that, you want to incorporate this to the story, you want to add this, you want to add that other, but you have to like know why are you doing what you're doing in order to control that eye or your senses in that way, because that's what in the end have like exploited, you know, the violence or like the shock or like what some people call the misery porn and all that, you know, like. So in my case, I thought, how can I look at Monterrey in one way and to this world with the kid and the gangs, you know, and all the counterculture and their values with respect and love, and in the way that I'm looking at it, that it's of course somehow romanticized. How? And the question that I found, what the answer, I'm sorry, was to have this character who is in displacement, in exile, who has migrated and who's looking back and home, and feeling and thinking that home is home, even if like bullets are flying, home is home, you know. And by looking back, you know, we are like on board of the character's memory, you know, and what's meaningful and important for him. And then we're looking through his emotions and through his eyes to that past, but in a real context, you know, like that's why I wanted to somehow balance, you know, and you have the voice of the real president, you know, in the film, and you have the other elements of the news and the narco bloqueos and the tapados, but just in the those that for me made sense, you know. The same with the drive-by scene in the film. It's just one scene, and I just didn't want to cut. I didn't want to have it be like more manipulative, you know. I just wanted to have it and have a parallel of like in time and space. How long will it last? Just the same that some kids just dancing, you know. And it's in one way, it can feel like a very long take, and in the other one it can feel like a very short take, but it's the same amount of time, and it's to actually overlap and compare those two things. So just to wrap it up, I would say that truthful representation has to do not only with repeating formulas, not only through exploiting like the shocking values of the stories, or like the dire dark elements, but by also like questioning the architecture of those representation, and trying to understand and get in on the eyes of the people that we are talking about, or the stories that we are trying to represent. And first, the most important parameter of representation, it's those who are represented. How many times you didn't see a film from Latin America like being like super violent and sordid and like making a huge success outside in Europe, you know? But then people in the film, do they think represented? You know, that if like, you know, I think those questions are right there, right in front of us, you know, and the answers too.
Yeah, that was great. I would just add to that, Fernando. I mean, creating three-dimensional characters, right? And just really doing a lot of research, and not just using sort of like these one-dimensional sort of stock characters. So for example, in my own researching cholos and cholas, Hollywood, the way they paint cholos and cholas is like they're all just gangsters, right? And they like to hang out in alleys, which, you know, in my neighborhood, we don't have alleys. You know, I live in a colonia. It's like we don't have alleys. And so even the way that cholos and cholas are represented in Hollywood is not always correct. And yeah, we do have those that, you know, get into trouble. But, you know, even narcos have emotions and stories, but we don't often get into that deep of an analysis of narcos, right? Like usually they're just stock characters, like, oh, drug dealers and violence, and that's it. But we never learn about like, well, how did this person become a narco? This person wasn't born a narco, you know. And so I think, you know, three-dimensional characters is important, and no matter, you know, what character it is that you're trying to represent. But also I get what you're saying, Fernando, about like you don't have to live that experience to tell that story. But I think for so long, especially in Hollywood, the stories have been told through the perspectives of white men. And I just think that like that needs to change. You know, we need to think about who are the people writing these stories, who are the people behind the scenes, like producing these productions. Like, for example, a film that won Best Picture of the Year, Roma by Alfonso Cuarón. You know, it's a beautiful film, but honestly, like I can't help to think how that film would have been if it had been from the perspective of Yalitza's character, right? If the film had been written and directed by Yalitza, you know, how different the film would be if. And so, of course, you know, Roma is from the perspective of someone who had, you know, a maid, and this is sort of his romantic view of that experience. But I'm almost willing to bet that if it had been written by a brown woman who actually did do that type of work, we might have a different experience, you know. And especially when we're, you know, trying to represent, you know, women in television. I see so many times, like in animations on television, especially when they're depicting a family, there's always like the teenage girl who everybody ignores, you know, like in Family Guy, like every animation that you can think of. What was that, Ronnie? George Lopez. Oh, like in the George Lopez show, you know, there's that teenage daughter, and she's always sort of like the one who's just a pain, and there's really no she's not as developed, and it's this stock character that we see in all family dramas. So that's just something to think about that I just wanted to add. But if anyone else wants to.
Those were beautiful answers. I would just add, you know, I think that it's up to all of us as consumers of media and of stories also to take responsibility and note our own tendencies, perhaps to look to victimhood and stories of suffering as a basis for empathy. And, you know, I'm really interested right now in stories and representations of the border, which has such a deep history of being essentialized and glorified often as a space of violence. I'm interested in looking where the stories of joy are within, you know, not ignoring any context of violence, but seeing this whole range of human emotion as a basis for empathy and connection. Thank you both. I think Ivan had something to add too.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rita. I really, I'm agreeing with you. Really, it's very important to find each other through the art, but at the same time to find this way. I was reading all your questions, and thank you so much for all the comments and reflections, and all of them are around to find a way to put the art in this dialogue with the design of public policies, in the approval of different laws, but at the same time in this kind of transformation or changes worldwide in the culture and counterculture, because of course the art has this impact, and through the history, the art and the movements are, several movements, social movements are coming from the art too, and having a way to make this dialogue between, for example, today, between the academia perspective, artistical perspective, and with all of your reflections, in the end, we got here on a very rich blend of questions and answers in our minds. And we are really have a lot of tasks to do, a lot to do with our job too, but especially with these reflections that can make several actions in our job and coming from our job. And thank you again to all of you. And I think that we can do a change in this perspective worldwide. For example, when I was with you in Chile, Gabriel, the migration was a different reflection from our migration. And when you study how the people migrate in Europe or in Asia are different, but in the end, it's the same discussion, the same problem, that we can make maybe with just our job, we can open a little door that can open another doors, and in the end we can find each other in this labyrinth and finding some ways to going out to there to find a way together. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Fernando.
Yes, sorry. No, just a couple of things just to touch up on what Dr. Carrissaldux and Rita were saying. I agree, you know, but I mean, I would like to just say or share my opinion in terms of the three-dimensional characters. For example, Rita, you know, like certain genres or certain things need for the characters to not be three-dimensional, just like you know, like a Greek theater, you know, or like farcic representation, and you need them to be one note to make a point. So I don't know, I would be just very careful about like these expectations. And right now, you know, like when Rita's saying about joyful stories, that's for me where the three dimensions come real, you know, like come into play. It's not so much about how to, like, for me, have like the correct angle and the correct thing, and who is representing and what and who, you know, like right now, like the every grant application, everything, you know, like it's so scared and wants to be on the right side of story, you know, that it's just like reducing everything and becoming so narrow, because like it's trying to hit and be on the right side of history and having quotas, you know, and then like this authenticity becomes the authenticity of representation becomes pro forma versus like real authenticity, you know, like and this idea of just wanting to do things correct and giving voice to the correct people, it's just like it's being very limiting, because there's no way our stories can come across without being transgressive, Like, look at the situation we live. It needs to be like, as a region, it needs to be transgressive. We cannot subscribe to these quotas of like who and you know, and I think for me the question is why. And again, I really like what Rita was saying in terms of like this. It's not only about the tragedy. But it's also not about the joy. And that's where for me the 3 dimensions come from. You know, like in the same day you have like you're angry, you're sad, but you're joy, and then maybe you woke up that day in a terrible mood, but then after lunch you were singing a song. That's how life is. You know, that's what like truthful representation is. Our idiosyncratic values as Latinos are very different. You know. And that's why I challenge the architecture of like stories, you know, like maybe we learn lessons in a different way, you know, and I think it's more about being faithful to those values, and also question some other things that are like the mainstream becoming so conservative and wanting to do everything right now, you know, and give voice only to like the specific voices at specific genders, specific, you know, like that's something to be very careful, because that can be like very narrowing, very limiting, you know, and there's no way like we can push without being transgressive. And transgressive doesn't mean violent. You can be transgressive with joy, which is something like Ivan's spirit communicates very, very well, you know, or Rita, you know. So that's something very important for me to add. Thank you.
Definitely, I think that we can agree now that it is the commitment that exists between the author of the piece and the story that it's telling. And it's not just imposing a point of view of the author, it's letting the character talk about what he's experiencing and what is all the process that he's going through, and what is that story made of. And I think that unfortunately we don't have time to go over more questions or go over more of these exciting ideas, but I think that the panel has sparkled some interesting points of reflection that we are going to have many times now to try to internalize those questions and those ideas and see how we can, as audience, do something and obviously transform into creators in so many ways. So I will give these last minutes that we have to Dr. Wilkinson to share some concluding remarks so we can wrap it up this conversation. Thank you so much for everyone.
Okay, well, first of all, many thanks to Gabriel Dominguez Partida for the idea and the organizational work behind this, bringing together some very important and powerful voices on a key topic. So thank you very much, Gabriel, for all your work in organizing this. I'll be honest, I'm a little reluctant to say much more, because I think these have been really powerful ideas. And, you know, thank you so much to our 4 presenters, Fernando, Elvira, Ivan, and Rita, not only for the great content of what you're saying, but also the spirit in which it's been communicated, which of course is a big part of communication, right? Is sort of, you know, the ethos and what's communicated through the way that you express yourselves. I'd like to pick up a little bit on something that Brita said, and that is that the dialogue between practitioners and academics is key. And so I guess I'll give you sort of an academic perspective on that, but one coming from the College of Media and Communication, and also the Harris Institute for Hispanic and International Communication. And I should point out that we've got a lot of folks from different departments across campus here at Texas Tech, which I think is great in terms of recognition of the importance of this topic, but also I think it underscores the fact that communication is spread through so many disciplines across campus. I guess we get to put the name on the outside of the building, but it's really at the core of what is being done in all these different areas, the wonderful things that are being done in all these different areas on this campus and campuses around the globe. So I'd just like to reinforce maybe a few points, and this is, I'll try not to be too didactic here, but to the students, I encourage you to think about this relationship between, the practitioners and academics, and that a lot of what we're encouraging you to do isn't just, study the theories and, the names and authors and all that, but is to think about these processes and, what it means to be an engaged, educated person in contemporary society. I think the challenges, facing that responsibility are growing all the time. Certainly the last, 5 to 10 years have underscored the fact that there's a lot more that we need to carry forward as engaged members of society. I think it was really important what Fernando said about communication at sort of being at the core of character and narrative development. It's also, of course, key to our understanding about issues at the border and our empathy toward the people who are engaged in them, right? And I'm not talking about just sort of, feeling sorry after seeing conventional news pictures, but we've seen a broad perspective of different ways of trying to approach and understand La Frontera and the people who are affected by it, which isn't only right on the border, but much further, into both, in this case, the United States and Mexico, but similar dynamics on borders across the world. So I think that's really important, are those elements of understanding and empathy. And what that requires is us investing the time and effort and emotion into understanding them more deeply. That is getting beyond some of those surface narratives that I think all of the speakers talked about. Elvira's point about building a society that promotes change is super important, because I think we're at a point right now, both in the United States and in Mexico, where there's a lot of frustration with the status quo. And unless we start, focusing on change and ways of moving there, we can't expect things to change. We can expect more of the same, or perhaps even worse, although that seems hard to imagine at this point in the pandemic and, some of the political and social stresses that have been experienced on both sides of the border. Also, her idea of, needing these alternatives to typical media coverage. In fact, in my class in international communication last night, we were talking about this, and I was showing some political spots from back in 2010 that are, super aggressive. And, it doesn't take much. You can have a 15, 20-second commercial that can really do a lot of damage very, very quickly in terms of, portraying different people and sort of setting those narratives. And if we don't have, a certain level of media literacy and understanding and critical engagement of those kinds of texts, then they can have the intended effect. We need to push back and say, heck no, we're not going to accept that. And it's through the kind of art and the kind of approach that all of you have advocated here that we can do that. Yvonne, the notion of opening these forums for discussion is super important, and I'm really glad that all of you participated. Thanks also to the audience for being here and hanging in. I should also point out that we've got a couple of folks in the audience from a school that we do quite a bit of collaboration from, actually where Gabriel worked before he came here to do his PhD, the Universidad Panamericana in Guadalajara. And just the fact that some of the folks there have shown up and are interested in this topic and are continuing a dialogue that we've had over several years about representation of the other across the border is super important. And so we thank Sandra and Patty, and there may have been some other names I didn't recognize from there. We need to engage those sorts of collaborative exchanges, those dialogues, institutionally as well as sort of individually. Also, this notion of dialogue as well as writing as a healing process. Yvonne, thank you very much for that. I think, again, communication is implicit in that. And I think it's really good, that you're speaking openly about pain and healing, not only in terms of, your personal experiences, but more collectively, you know, what we're going through with the pandemic and trying to move out of it. We need to recognize that, and without the recognition, then we can't take the really important steps, as you're mentioning, of sort of, you know, confronting it and dealing with it. And thank you for your work. And, you know, it must have been quite, you know, painful for you to work through that, but we all benefit from being able to then sort of, you know, engage what you went with and went through, excuse me, and the outcome of that. So I also wanted to mention a couple of things that Brita mentioned, dialogue between practitioners and academics, as I mentioned, sort of the frame for this, but also, you know, co-creation, touch, and play as forms of communication. I think in our college, we don't give enough emphasis to that, to these other forms beyond the usual text, whether it's, you know, the spoken word or something that's mediated. And we need to recognize that and, you know, emphasize it more. I really love the imagery and, you know, just sort of the approaches that the artists you were talking about were taking in terms of trying to bridge this divide, whether it's sort of bringing attention to the physical barriers and, you know, making connections across them, or, you know, some of the more, I guess, metaphoric connections as well. So bottom line, thank you all very, very much for your participation. Everybody on here, particularly the 4 presenters, and as I mentioned, Gabriel, this is exactly the kind of dynamic that we try to support through the Harris Institute. And if you do have ideas for, you know, future forums like this, please share them with us. We're certainly willing to do the legwork in terms of, you know, organizing and promoting and all that. But these are the sorts of exchanges that are right at the core of who we are and what we value. So I'll give it over to Gabriel for the very final word, and thank him once again for bringing us all together today.
Well, there is nothing to say. I don't want to abuse for the time and the generosity of our panelists. And the last thing that I want to say is muchas gracias to each one of you. Muchas gracias, Brita. Muchas gracias, Elvira. Muchas gracias, Ivan. Muchas gracias, Fernando. And muchas gracias to all of the participants that were, or to all the attendees that were here. And we hope that we can have the opportunity to share these kinds of ideas and these kinds of thoughts that I think are really interesting for students and for our community. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.